So, thank you for taking your seats. And we're going to resume the morning where we're exploring spatial numerical interactions in human brain and behavior. And I'm very happy to announce the next talk by Marco Zorzi, a key player in the field, Neuropsychological Impairments of Number, Space, and Time. Marco.
Okay, so I'm grateful to the other speakers who really nicely set the stage in a way. They really covered all the basics of the spatial numerical interactions. So I thought I can actually start from the theory, one of the theory mentioned by Wim Fias before, and then move on to show some of the key findings that support this kind of hypothesis. So I will focus my talk mostly on number-space interaction, but I will also touch, especially at the end, onto time-space interaction. But in terms of theory, of course it's a theory, so it's perfectly falsifiable. The idea is that we have a mental number line and we have a mental timeline. This can be sort of summarized into the following points. Number, or time, is represented along a spatial continuum akin to a line. Not a line, of course, not a physical line. It's similar. It has a spatial metric which is similar to that of a physical line. In mathematics, you would call this an homeomorphism, so a similarity in the metric. The spatial orientation of the mental number line or mental timeline is embodied and culturally mediated, so it follows the spontaneous scanning habits, and we already heard about this from Martin Fisher and Sam Saki. If there is no particular manipulation implemented in the experimental setup, it spontaneously conforms to writing direction. So in Western cultures, the relative small or short or past is on the left, and the relative large or long or future is on the right. Third, number and also time is represented in terms of a spatial position on the mental number line or mental timeline, not in absolute but in relative terms. So this in a way addresses the point made very strongly by Wim Fias that there is perhaps nothing so strongly encoded in long-term memory, but a large part of what we see is due to coding of a quantity, temporal or numerical, not intrinsically as left or right in absolute terms, but with respect to a reference point or to an interval. And of course, this has to be task dependent. Fourth, the claim is that spatial attention is involved in accessing this type of representations, whether long or short-term memory based. The point is that impairments of spatial attention following brain damage, as well as experimental manipulations of spatial attention, can affect number and time processing. And that's really the key aspects that I will cover during my talk. So let's start with the first sort of line of evidence showing how spatial and attentional biases influence number processing. You already heard from Stan this morning that key findings about number-space interaction historically have come from the study of patients with visuospatial neglect. This is an acquired neuropsychological disorder characterized by lack of conscious perception and exploration of the space, which is contralateral to the lesion. And this is a kind of disorder that can be present in the absence of sensory motor deficits and is typically observed following lesions to the right hemisphere, so causing neglect for the left hemisphere or left neglect. The major clinical manifestations of neglect are sort of very briefly illustrated here. For example, if you ask a patient to cross out a number of targets on a sheet of paper, the patient will only mark the rightmost targets and omit all the leftmost ones. Of course, this can be highly variable according to the severity of neglect. Another classic test is a visual line bisection. So you give a patient a horizontal visual line, again, on a sheet of paper is a classic paper and pencil task, and asking the patient to mark the midpoint, the middle of this line. The patient will displace it far to the right, again, with some variability from patient to patient, as if the patient were not perceiving the leftmost part of the line. This is how a neglect patient would explore the space, the visual space during a visual search for a target. As you can see, these are all saccades, eye movements, and they are all sort of restricted to the rightmost part of space. The same or similar features are also observed in drawing. For example, in drawing from memory, if you give the patient a model and then ask the patient to draw, for example, this clock face, the patient will likely omit many of the left-hand features, also for the copy of a house or of a flower, and so on. And it's important also to note that neglect extends, it's already a bit implicit in this kind of task, but neglect can affect mental imagery. So for example, the patient asked to describe from memory his own bedroom may omit a number of features on the left-hand side according to the viewpoint, of course. So, and the classic, very famous experiment where this remarkable discovery was made was by Bisiach and collaborators. He asked patients to describe the famous Piazza del Duomo in Milan, and depending on which side of the Piazza del Duomo the patient was asked to imagine, the left-hand details were omitted from the description, from the verbal description of the familiar place. Now, as Stan mentioned before, back in 2002, we devised a task, which is now widely known as number bisection task, where in which patients are asked to tell aloud the number that is halfway in a given numerical interval without doing any calculations, without doing any maths. So for example, if you ask, you give the numbers 3 and 7 as an interval, what is the number halfway between 3 and 7? It's easy to do without any maths. You say 5. This can, of course, was done for a range of different interval lengths and also for units, teens, and 20s, and so on. The rationale was also to compare performance in this task to the classic line bisection task, which is, as I mentioned, is used also for neglect diagnosis. What is interesting about the line bisection task is that there is an effect of line length So the deviation of the midpoint increases systematically, so becomes shifted more and more towards the right-hand side of the line as the line is longer in millimeters. There is also another paradoxical phenomenon called crossover effect that is only seen for the shortest line. This is 25 millimeters, so it's a very short line, 2 centimeters and a half. As you can see from this graph, the displacement is not on the right, but is on the left. So that's why it's called a crossover. And this is a significant effect, although small. When we tested patients in this number bisection task, what we found is a remarkable similarity in the pattern of errors in the number bisection task and in the visual line bisection task. So here is the size of the interval, 3, 5, 7, or 9 units, and this is the deviation in number units. So, for example, if you take an interval like 2 and 8, the patient, as a midpoint, would give you 7. So, as if the patient was omitting, in a way, or neglecting the left part of the numerical interval. And these are 4 different patients all show this pattern of increasing deviation towards bigger numbers, larger numbers, putatively on the right side of the number line. Okay, so the idea now is that if the bias is towards the bigger numbers, it's like a bias towards the right, exactly like in line bisection. Control patients and healthy controls did not show any bias in this task, and this is fairly typical. Actually, I will show later that no healthy participants show, if anything, they show a bias towards the left, towards smaller numbers, not towards larger numbers. In a follow-up study, we also investigated how different types of bisection tasks may or might not yield different patterns of results. Indeed, in visual line bisection and in number interval bisection, this is now group data on a group of neglect patients, show a very similar pattern of errors. Again, the classic modulation by number interval length and the crossover effect. You can see that these values are negative for the shorter interval, just like here. And when the same patient performed a bisection of letter intervals, or, for example, tell me what letter is between A and E, halfway, there was a different pattern. So in particular, there was no modulation by interval length, although there was a tendency towards overestimation. So again, going towards the later letters in the alphabet compared to the middle, to the real middle. And for months, again, a different pattern. So there is an interesting dissociation between the performance in a numerical task and in matched tasks that do not involve numbers, but still involve ordered material. And so this is something that should be explained, for example, by a working memory account. Another key finding, just shortly after our first report on neglect and neglect from number space, it was a study on number comparison by Patrick Villemeux and colleagues. This study is truly remarkable because what they observed is that patients simply asked to compare numbers by magnitude. So there was a comparison against a fixed standard. So you would see a single, or here a single number, a one-digit number, and tell whether the number is larger or smaller than 5. There is a very atypical increase of reaction times for the number which is immediately smaller than the reference number. So here the reference is 5. Typically reaction times increase as we go closer to the reference. This is well-known distance effect. But here you can see that only in the neglect patients, the distance effect was highly asymmetrical. If anything, in normal controls, it should be the other way around. So it should be slightly asymmetric towards the larger numbers, because there is also a size effect in number magnitude comparison. But this is exactly the opposite. So this was interpreted in terms of a difficulty in processing the number that is immediately to the left of the reference in number space. Okay, so if you compare 4 to 5, 4 is to the left on the number line, and therefore neglect would make this comparison more difficult than, for example, comparing 5 to 6. I was mentioning the fact that this effect is really is not an absolute effect, but is relative to the standard, to the reference number or to the interval. And indeed, when Villemier and colleagues did the same task, but now changing the reference to 7, so now 7 is the reference, though you have to say whether the number is smaller or bigger than 7. Now 6 and also 5 are very slow. Of course, there was nothing like that before, so you see that is completely dependent upon the identity of the reference number. Another study which supports again this idea of a difficulty in processing numbers smaller or to the left of some kind of reference number comes from an ERP study. In this study, we had again neglect patients, but this time we recorded evaluated potentials, and we used an auditory oddball paradigm. And basically, there was a stream of numbers, most of the time 5, so it's a frequent number, so it's 5, 5, 5 over and over again. And there was a rare target number, which was either 1 or 9 in separate blocks. Okay. And so the patient has to report when he hears the target number, so the oddball. To cut the story short, what we found is that a particular brainwave called the P3B, and in particular the latency of this brainwave, which is related to categorization of the stimulus and is not affected by response selection, execution, or any post-categorization processes, was delayed to 1, and one also slightly faster to 9 in the neglect patients compared to controls. So basically, the brain of these neglect patients responded faster to the 9 and responded slower to the 1. Okay. This was true only for neglect patients and not for a sample of other patients without neglect. Now, there are other studies, like this one, another very influential study by Yves Rossetti and collaborators, showing how manipulating visuospatial attention through tools that are widely used for neglect rehabilitation, like prismatic adaptation, or you will see in the next slide, optokinetic stimulation, can modulate the number bisection bias. Okay, so this is extremely interesting because it shows if we can modulate the bias shown by patients by manipulating their visuospatial attention, it clearly shows that the origin of this bias is attentional, visuospatial in nature. Indeed, a short adaptation to rightward deviating prisms, these are like prismatic googles that shift the entire visual field about 10 degrees to the right, which is followed by an adaptation period. This usually affects how actions and exploration of the physical space is performed by the patient, so it ameliorates neglect, typically. But it also ameliorated the number bisection. So it reduced significantly, quite significantly, the number bisection bias between after this short adaptation to rightward prisms. Another technique which has been also tested and used for neglect rehabilitation is optokinetic stimulation. So these are basically alternated black and white stripes that move with a certain speed towards the right or towards the left. And this type of visual stimulation can also elicit what is called the optokinetic nystagmus. So basically, the eyes start to follow the stripes, and then they come back. And so they move, they follow the stripes, and then they come back to the center, and so on. And what we did is to use this technique and test one patient in the number bisection task using 3 different conditions of optokinetic stimulation. Static, so which is like the normal, the control, the baseline condition, where there was the typical bias. These are the controls. When the patient or the controls, they received left optokinetic stimulation, the control group was unaffected, but the patient showed a marked reduction of the number bisection bias. After right optokinetic stimulation, again, there was no effect on the controls. For the patient, the bias was not increased, which you may have expected, but perhaps it was a ceiling already. But interestingly, it decreased the variability. So in a way, the patient was more confident in saying that 8 is the midway between 1 and 9. Okay, so it reduced the variability of responses, which in the neglect literature can be understood as a reduction of the so-called indifference zone. In healthy participants, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a neurostimulation technique, applied on the posterior parietal cortex, induced a type of virtual neglect in number bisection. So again, this is converging evidence with the role of the right hemisphere in producing this type of numerical bias, because stimulation of the left posterior parietal cortex did not produce any bias. So the bias was present only after right stimulation. In terms of healthy participants, I mentioned that there is several studies have now reported a leftward rather than a rightward bias. And this can be explained, again, in terms of general spatial attentional biases that are widely studied in the healthy population. For example, in a number line bisection, in the number bisection task, using, of course, large intervals, not like the ones we use with patients because controls do not make errors typically. There was a systematic bias towards smaller numbers, which would be on the left of the number line. And of course, this bias increased with the numerical mean. So basically, similar to the pattern found with neglect patients, but in the opposite direction. Interestingly, I jump to this slide immediately. Pseudo-neglect is modulated by the viewing distance, both in visual line bisection and in number interval bisection. This is truly extraordinary because it's strange, but the distance at which the stimuli for the number interval bisection were presented to the participants produced a modulation of the numerical bias, which was very similar to the modulation for the physical line bisection task. And there was also quite a good correlation between the physical and the number bisection tasks, both in terms of the intercept and the slopes of the participants. Also, Stan, I think, again mentioned random digit generation, and again, the finding, now replicated many times, is of a leftward bias, which can be also, again, modulated by a bodily dimension like head turns. So Löcher and colleagues asked the participants to turn their head like this, to the left or to the right, while they're randomly generating numbers. And again, this affected the bias. So it modulated this leftward bias. So again, showing the interplay between orienting in space, spatial attention, of course, and the performance in these numerical tasks. Now, I just need to mention that many now, quite many studies have reported dissociations between number bisection and line bisection in neglect patients. And in the neglect patient, there is a lack of correlation between numerical and spatial bias. To me, this is not very surprising because the different aspects of neglect are widely known to doubly dissociate from each other in all varieties, including tasks within the imaginal neglect, within the imaginal dimension of neglect. The associations, on the other hand, at least in my opinion, are still informative because there is, as I mentioned, the similarity in the error patterns, the correlations between, with regard to pseudo-neglect at least, and also the finding that when there is a right imaginal neglect, the bias switches to the left in the numerical bisection task. So again, supporting the idea that this bias is truly related to neglect and not to other factors. Of course, a main topic today was SNARC, and so I need to mention the SNARC effect, what happens to neglect patients when they perform a SNARC task. I'm running rather short, so I will go a bit faster. Basically, if patients are performing a parity judgment task, these are their SNARC slopes. Healthy controls and patients do not differ. So there is no effect of neglect. And at that time, we interpret this finding in terms of a dissociation between the explicit processing of magnitude information, like in the number bisection task, and the implicit processing that is implied by parity judgment. So the deficit would be seen only when the task requires direct explicit access to the mental number line. And this was recently confirmed in a more direct test of this hypothesis, because we compared in the same patients the parity task again and the number comparison task, which now taps explicit access to numerical magnitude. And here we found basically a difference between neglect patients and the control patients only in the explicit number comparison task, but not in the parity judgment task. And the two tasks are absolutely identical, both in terms of stimuli and response. So it's only the nature of the task that is changing. And what we found in the magnitude task is that there was a stronger SNARC effect for the neglect patients, particularly for the larger numbers. Okay, so for the numbers put on the right of the mental number line. And this can be interpreted as an exaggerated effect of number space compatibility after an ipsilational orienting in number space. Responding left after you have processed a big number, because it's on the right, is particularly hard for neglect patients. And this resembles, or at least is conceptually not so dissimilar for the disengaged deficit that has been reported in visual space. We also found only for the magnitude task this asymmetry in number comparison. So you can see again this paradoxical increase of reaction times for the number 4, which is immediately to the left or smaller than the reference 5. And this is true again only for the magnitude task. In the same patients doing the parity task do not show absolutely anything for strange about 4. Okay, so it's really only during the comparison task. This pattern, this asymmetry in the distance effect can be modulated by coherent motion. Salilas and colleagues show that coherent, in particular, leftward coherent motion, again, manipulating visual spatial attention, reduced, almost abolished this asymmetry in the distance effect. Again, an asymmetry emerges after repetitive TMS on the posterior parietal areas, and interestingly, in this study, the stimulation site was chosen to produce interference on a serial visual search task. So again, is a clearly attentional area, and it produced an asymmetric distance effect. Now, I will not talk about how number processing produces spatial biases. This is basically the studies done by Martin Fischer. They were mentioned already a couple of times. We also did various studies showing how processing numbers can produce shifts of spatial attention. These are not particularly important. No, they are important in showing how number processing can trigger shifts of attention, but they are not really telling us whether spatial attention is causally linked to number processing. So what I'm saying is that the shift of spatial attention induced by processing a number might be epiphenomenal to number processing, Whereas what we want to see is whether directly, explicitly manipulating visuospatial attention can influence number processing task. And this was done in normals. I don't really have time to explain these studies. This is a first study where we manipulated visuospatial attention. We obtained an influence on both number comparison and parity judgments. I also invite you to have a look at the poster here by Ranzini and co-authors, showing again that attentional orienting distorts the distance effect. You see, we got a very asymmetric distance effect in number comparison only when healthy participants attended to a cue on the far right side of space. The same type of visuospatial priming with irrelevant cues we've shown that can also influence duration judgments on auditory tones. So now this is related not to number processing but to time processing. I also invite you to have a look at the poster by Simone Cutini, where we reported, this is actually already published, we report the hemodynamic correlates of the Snark effect. If you want to know more about number space versus time space interactions, we recently published a very comprehensive review and theoretical synthesis showing how all these different phenomena, which were mentioned today, in the numerical domain, most of them have been already reported in the time domain, both in terms of time concepts, so something like, for example, before, after, or future, past, and for temporal duration, short, long. So as a summary, I think I tried to cover some of the evidence that there are bidirectional interactions between perceptual space and numerical space. Number processing produces spatial biases in perception, and this was seen in a variety of tasks, detection, line bisection, temporal order judgment, and so on. Importantly, visuospatial cues, even completely irrelevant ones, can bias number processing, like in the case of visuospatial priming. And finally, and perhaps also most importantly, these spatial biases in perception, like neglect, but also pseudo-neglect, influence number processing. Overall, I think the picture that is clearly emerging is that these interactions are mediated by spatial attention mechanisms, and all types of interactions, or most types of interactions, are between numbers and space, generalized or can also be found for time and space. So these results, I think, support the hypothesis which I put forth at the very beginning, so that there is a common spatial metric of representation for numbers and time, and that spatial attention is, or seems at least to be, routinely involved in number and time processing tasks. Thank you very much, and I have to thank you a very large number of collaborators.